Hello and welcome to another edition of Legislative Update. My name is Tom Ayers. I'm the senior staff writer for the Vermont Standard newspaper in Woodstock. This program is produced weekly in collaboration with our friends at Okemo Valley TV. As always, our guest is Representative Charlie Kimbell of Woodstock, representing Woodstock, Plymouth, and Reading in the Vermont House. And the legislature has just come out of what is known as crossover week, when legislation passes between the Senate and the House back and forth for reconciliation in the coming weeks, heading into a final vote on those pieces of legislation. But before we talk about that, Charlie, welcome. And
Thank you.
let's talk about something else that happened last week. Governor Scott's veto of the Budget Reconciliation Act. Do I have that?
Budget Adjustment Act, right,
Budget Adjustment Act. Okay,
right.
thank you. So he vetoed the Budget Adjustment Act last week. What is the Budget Adjustment Act, and what was his reasoning behind the veto?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. It's always great to be back with you. The Budget Adjustment Act really, in most years, is just a technical adjustment to what the revenues and expenses have been for the first half of the fiscal year. Vermont runs on a fiscal year that goes July 1st through January 30th. And so by the end of December, you've actually got 6 months of actual experience with what you have for revenues and expenses. And there's also then a forecast for what they will be for the remaining 6 months. That's produced by a consensus forecast with the governor's economist and also the legislature's economist. So that gives a lot of food for then to what levers to adjust. You know, are the revenues on track or are they not on track? Are expenses on track with the budget that was passed the previous year? So the governor proposes a budget adjustment to recognize those differences, and then sometimes with the request of the legislature to get grant authority to spend money that was not in the original budget that was passed in the previous legislative session for that fiscal year. So that's what the Budget Adjustment Act is. And
Mm-hmm.
so the governor proposed a Budget Adjustment Act in, I think it was late January, early February. And the House Finance Committee is the one that's in House Appropriations. I'm sorry, House Appropriations is the one that's in charge of really the initial run through. We pass it as a House, and then pass it over to the Senate. They passed it as well with some changes, and then it went into a conference committee. That's what you do when the two bodies don't agree on what it is. Each body then has three people from their body to meet in a conference committee. They come up with what they agree on, and that's they pass those back, and both the House and the Senate passed that Budget Adjustment Act. The governor vetoed it, which we knew was going to be a possibility, but really surprising. And he vetoed it because of the inclusion of one thing, and we might have talked about it a little bit before, and that's $1.8 million to extend the hotel and motel voucher program, as it's commonly known, for those who
Mm-hmm.
are homeless or unhoused. That's a temporary shelter program that would extend the timeline from March to the end of June. So it's an extension of an existing program. The governor does not like this particular general assistance program, as it's formally called, and wants to see some changes, doesn't think it's really achieves as much as we think it does. And the legislature has voiced its opinion that no, we really think this is necessary to provide housing for vulnerable people inside the state. We know that there's an additional program that needs to be rolled out to provide supports around those people that are unhoused, whether it's mental health or other kinds of financial assistance. But
Mm-hmm.
and then we're working on that. But the governor said, no, we're not going to do that. So he vetoed the whole bill, which is incredible because the legislature agreed with about 99% of what's in the bill. I mean, now we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in there. Just to give you an idea of what else was included, um, there was, $1.8 million towards relief for flood impacted communities. And so that's, Barry, Plainfield, those towns actually had
Mhm.
floods in 2024. $10.4 million towards additional affordable housing investments. So that's pretty large. $31 million towards emergency fiscal relief for healthcare providers. There are many healthcare providers that are hanging on by a thread, and they are asking for financial assistance so they don't have to close up shop. And then another $11 million towards some essential institutions like the Vermont Veterans Home that's down in Bennington. So
Mhm.
that's just a handful of some of the things. And also in that Budget Adjustment Act were some technical corrections that have to be made, whether it's for the fees that we charge on phone services and that kind of stuff. And
Mhm.
then changing some of the sunsets that we have on different bills. So where we are with that now is the legislature is coming back to say, okay, since do we make another run at it with a different version of a budget adjustment, or do we just incorporate those pieces into other bills and try to pass that through the legislature? We're not clear right now as to which strategy we're going to take. It really depends on conversations that happen today, March 17th, with the administration and with legislative leaders. So
Mhm.
it's all
Mhm.
very much live in real time as to what's going on. Yeah.
Now, what is the requirement for overriding a veto? It's two-thirds, correct?
It's two-thirds,
Yeah.
two-thirds of both bodies, the Senate and the House. So in the House, we have 150 members, so it would take 100 votes. The Democrats last year had over 100 members. This year, they've got 88 members. So there was not the ability to just bring that back and override the veto.
Mhm.
The Republicans fell in line with the governor's request and voted against it in the floor of the House. I'm not sure what happened in the Senate. So it's clear that there's not enough support to try to override the governor's veto.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and so I think we'll probably take the second path where we take pieces of it and put that in different pieces of legislation and move that forward. I think.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Well, we'll continue to follow that in the weeks to come and see how that plays out. Last week, as I mentioned, was crossover week,
right.
where legislation moves back and forth between the Senate and the House, and you attempt to come to agreement on those pieces of legislation. What are some of the major pieces, just maybe two examples, possibly three, of major pieces of legislation that crossed over? And what's the process with those from here?
Yeah, so what's interesting, they haven't made the full crossover yet, not most of them anyway, because they have to then come out of committee, come to the floor. So the crossover is when it has to leave its committee of jurisdiction and then come to the floor of either body, the House or the Senate, and then get
Mhm.
approved. So at this point, we are reviewing those pieces of legislation in the House. We've got a very full agenda over this next week to determine whether or not we'll support it and send it over to the Senate. So some of those, there's an environmental bill that's fairly large. There's a housing bill with many different elements to it that we have to review each one. And I'd say for that, there's additional money that's being allocated to Vermont Housing Finance Agency uh, for a lot of different initiatives for affordable housing. And I think part of it's for the Vermont Housing Investment Program, and that is to expand monies for addition of accessory dwelling units on different properties,
Mhm.
as well as converting blighted properties into useful properties. So
Mhm.
there's some additional money for that. That's been a very successful program, and the state investment is fairly low, and the results are pretty high.
Mhm.
So that's big. We do have a bill. I haven't seen it yet, and that's coming out of the Human Services Committee in the House, and um, that has to deal with this whole general assistance program for housing for unhoused people. So that's really coming out of the House now. We'll be passing it over to the Senate probably next week, so that we have this program. And it's not going to be in time to, extend the program from March, which is, we're towards the end of March.
Right.
Um,
right?
So, so it's not going to be in time to save that, but we'll see if there's other means that we can move that kind of legislation through.
Mhm.
Um, but there's stuff from the agricultural committee. So it's amazing. I think there's probably 50 bills that got approved from the House, and there's probably an equal number from the Senate that is just really coming through the committees. I know Senator Clarkson talked about a housing and economic development bill, and one of those in the Senate is looking at how to provide tax increment financing for housing developments. Right now, tax increment financing is not limited to housing developments, but there's a limit to how many you can have across the state. And this
Mhm.
tries to carve out an exemption for housing. And it's more based on that particular project, not as to a whole district, which usually TIFs do. So that's
Mhm.
some of the stuff that's coming through. And then we've got a tax credit bill coming through our committee that looks to expand the earned income tax credit for low income Vermonters, as well as the child tax credit, and also raising the income threshold for which you can deduct your Social Security income from your adjusted gross income. So those are all free.
Yeah, and then there's that time honored issue, the old bugaboo of education finance reform.
Whoa, that is, yes. We've been granted an extension by the leaders in the House and the Senate that we
Yes,
don't have to have that wrapped up in our House by until the end of this month.
right.
So
We discussed that a bit last week. So
so
yeah.
it's 2 weeks. It's not that much time. So the House Education just shared with us what they think is a range of the number of school districts to have, not the five that the governor's proposed and not the 119 that we currently have, but somewhere between 10 and 25, school
Mhm.
districts. And we'll be working on, and my committee, working on the financial aspect of it. What are the actual words in statute that create a foundation formula? When is it implemented? How do we look at the different school districts and do we give them the ability to raise more money than what the foundation formula delivers? And how is that actually accomplished? So those are some of the hard yards we're going to be working on in the next 2 weeks.
Do you have a sense if the Senate is working along similar lines? Maybe there'd be fewer or more districts, but are they in the same ballpark as the House, broadly speaking, on what this might look like?
Yeah, this is where the House makes fun of the Senate and the Senate makes fun of the House. Uh, so they've, in the House Education, the chair of that committee, Seth Bongartz from Manchester, has proposed 9 districts and a mix of supervisory unions and the school districts. And so they are moving ahead with some ideas, and the House is going to then have its own proposals. And that's where we'll try to reconcile those probably in April and May,
Mhm.
because we'll be passing out that education bill, which is going to be huge by the end of this month. They'll get it, they'll do their due diligence on it. So they don't have, I don't think at this point, a bill that they are proposing, but they have the structure of different pieces that they will either add to what we're doing or amend what we're doing. Yeah.
Mhm. And of course, all of you now have the benefit of town meeting day having come and gone and school budgets being approved, so you know what the sum total of what the unions in the districts, supervisory unions in the districts are asking for, what the voters have authorized.
Yeah.
So that at least gives you a baseline in that respect. Is that correct?
It does. Most school budgets passed. There's only 9 school districts that did not pass their school budgets, out of 113 that have voted so far. There's some that are voting later in April. Most of them were using the math that was delivered to them in the December 1st letter from the Commissioner of Taxes, and some with an updated yield that was a result of discussions in our committees in January. So to have them approved at what was already published then might create a false sense of approval by the voters that, okay, that's a good rate.
Mhm,
We know because as it affects their property taxes.
mhm,
It's good to see the approval, but we know that they still want additional property tax relief. And what we have to figure out is, do we use general fund money? The governor's asked us to consider using $77 million from the general fund to reduce property taxes. So there's two things that are coming into play here. One is, are we going to use that money on a one-time basis to reduce people's property taxes for the following year? Is it significant enough to really give them much relief?
mhm.
So that's the one question. The second question is, what's going on with the federal government? So do we need to hold some of that money aside in case things go to hell in a handbasket with the funding that's coming from the federal government? So
Mhm.
we're thinking maybe we shouldn't spend all that money this year if we haven't. So that's kind of the consideration that we've got going right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. That uncertainty around federal funding is obviously a nationwide problem on so many different levels, not just with education, but with
Absolutely right. Yeah.
so many aspects of the federal and state relationship. And I'm sure that's something that we'll continue to explore in legislative updates in the coming weeks. And it seems like it's changing from day to day coming out of Washington. One day you have one thing, and the next day they pull that back and put something else forward. Whether we'll have an education department at the federal level by the end of this legislative session or not, who knows?
Yeah.
Um, uh,
I mean, last week we had a cancellation of funding from the U.S. Department of Agriculture for funds that are used to purchase food from local farms for our schools. So that impacts some of those local farmers and small farmers that are selling into the school system. So that's a real issue. That's a few $1 million, and that we can expect more like that. It's unfortunate.
Well, without a doubt. Well, we'll continue to stay on top of it, and uh, I can't say I envy you lawmakers trying to parse what's coming out of the White House and coming out of Congress at this juncture, but uh, clearly doing your best to try and stay on top of it. Charlie, it's always a pleasure speaking with you, and we will connect again next week here on Legislative Update. Thanks for joining us again today.
Thank you, Tom.